Well, today we want to continue this afternoon with where we have been going. We've looked at Ellen White's life in general and how her call to ministry. The second portion, we looked at some of the blessings, her practical blessings that we've seen in her writings. And now we're going into the sketchy part. Okay? This is where people have made accusations, and we're going to deal with some of them, but doing so, taking the high road. Looking at these things in a sense of, as she put it this way, she talked about how that Jesus met his opponents. And that, you can take somebody tit for tat, point for point, and go down the road, and most people can't even follow you, and so you lose out. And Jesus didn't take them on point for point. He taught them the truth and left it to them to figure out what wasn't right. That's what we want to do, is to build the case for the strength of it, and not to be harsh in any way. Okay? So why the opponents of Ellen G. White get it wrong? I was introduced to this subject a while back, or not introduced because I've done it for a number of years, but I was invited to participate with a particular channel on YouTube that is known for being anti-Adventist. And I had watched a number of his presentations, and I had virtually vowed that I would never really consider going on a program with him because of his manner. I felt like he's not going to give me a fair shake. He wouldn't listen. And so why should I subject myself to that? But we got in touch with one another after I went on a program with another guy. There's a guy down in Australia who has his program. And I heard something in his presentation that was different. Ellen White spent a lot of time down in Australia.
Yes.
She almost stayed there.
Yeah.
She loved it so much. The people there loved her so much. She had such a beautiful time there. And when she left, they wrote notes, and there's a little book that tells about it. So they were going to miss her so badly. While she was there, this is what the fellow was talking about. He lived up the street in Wollongong from the house that she lived in. It's set up as kind of a museum there, and people can go and read materials and kind of like a little museum. And the college is also there. He happens to no longer be in ethics. But he was talking about Ellen White, and he said, it kind of puzzles me, because his mom is a local historian, Adventist, but also of the culture of that community. And he said, she brought me these articles where people would talk about Ellen White and the things that she did for them in the community. Somebody had a need, and she made sure that somebody had some money to help them fix a fence or to repair something, or there was a deficiency of jobs at that time. It was a depression in Australia. And so she would step in practical ways to help people and to help the work. Give you one story that took place. Ellen White suffered with arthritis for a number of years. And when she first went to Australia, the environment was really harsh on her. They have their winters and summers, the reverse of ours. And she got there when it was cold, and she was miserable. Rheumatoid arthritis, And so for the first year that she was there, she barely could write at all because of so much pain that she was going through. As she put it in a positive light, it was that experience that helped her to appreciate the sufferings of our Lord. But somebody heard about it, and that for her to even write once she got to a better place, they had to put her in a chair and prop up her arms in a certain way so that it didn't put weight on her shoulders, and so that she could write, and she'd write, and write she did, lots. But it was this kind of awkward thing with a chair, so somebody, a very kind person, donated this excellent chair for her comfort. She sold it. And the kids stuck with what she had so that they could take the money and help a new church that was getting started. That's not a one-off in her experience. So knowing these kinds of stories, this fellow, Peter Dickson is his name, said, I don't know what to do with that, because, you hear these criticisms that we hear, and these scholars who are presenting these flaws about her character, that she was conniving and controlling and all these things that they said. I've got these two different pictures of her. I don't know exactly what to do. And I said, I know what to do. I'll come on your program and we'll talk about it. So I did. And we had a very congenial conversation about that. He still bought into some of the ideas that people had presented about her on the other side. I didn't get a chance to present all of that. But there was this wonderful spirit, in our conversation, and that caught the attention of this other fellow who was running this other program. And I won't, anybody who's been watching these things knows who it is. But anyway, he invited me on, and I said, look, he wanted a debate between me and a former Adventist by the name of Steve Daly. And Steve has written a couple of books and used to be out in Alcira, and he was, he was a pastor, and so he has some credibility because he was an Adventist pastor, right? He should know. So he wanted me to do a debate. I said, I don't like the idea of debates because, debates don't necessarily bring you to the truth. They elucidate the debating ability of the two parties, and sometimes truth gets lost. And sometimes you get more heat than you get light. So I really don't really want to do a debate. He said, and furthermore, I believe if I have a difference with somebody, that I should go to that person first and express that idea so that if they want to make corrections, they can privately. I've had the experience of publishing something publicly and then getting feedback that embarrasses the socks off of me. I wish that somebody had told me about it before I had gone public, right? So I like that. I want to extend that to others. And so I have not spoken with Steve Daly yet. And I tried. Apparently I used the wrong channels. He said, well, you just did this. I said, yeah, now I know. But I never could really discuss it with him. He said, I want to invite you on the program to discuss these subjects. I said, okay, well, that sounds okay. So after I'd done some videos on it. Those of you who have seen my channel have seen some of the videos I did in response to specific points. And he took those specific points and made it into the subject matter we were supposed to discuss. I came on the program, and he said, okay, opening statements will be 5 minutes. You'll have a chance to rebut. And I said,
That's a debate. That's not a discussion.
that sounds like a debate. And it was. It was. And my friends told me that I did a better job. And his friends said that he did a better job. So, I think it pretty much split things down the middle. But what I did discover in the process was that he was relying on the opinions of other scholars to do his thinking for him. And he would cite them, and when I would go into the granularity, the specifics of it, can't even say the word, he didn't know what to do with it, because he had not studied it out himself. And so, in those cases, he looked unprepared, and when he made simple statements of apparent fact, which are opinions, which I had to explain with 2 or 3 things to be able to explain the context, he looked better, because what he said was simpler. And so that was the upshot of that experience. So I don't like the debates, but I do like to share the truth. And I do think that there are people that are asking these questions and do so with some sincerity, and others with mixed motivations. We all have different motivations. But I didn't recognize the Ellen White that he was describing. I didn't recognize it. I don't know if you've ever met somebody or heard somebody on TV describing somebody that you think you know, and they have a whole different slant. You say, how in the world did they get it there? So we all have different glasses, even if you're not wearing glasses. We look at things through different lenses. Some things we look at negatively from the start, and so you're not going to see positive. Some people have rosy-colored glasses. I tend to be an optimist as much as I can. So I cut people slack. I give them the benefit of the doubt. God's a better judge than I. All right, we missed the video at the beginning, so we're going to do that now. All right.
Yes, I knew Sister White in this way. I heard her preach once and saw her, of course. It was in Boulder, Colorado, at the camp meeting in 1909, in a building with an iron roof right at the base of the Red Rocks there. It's on the campus of the University of Colorado. And she was there. I suppose there were 200 Adventists, and maybe the rest of 1,000 people or 800 people were just people of the town, people of various denominations that wanted to see the Adventist prophet. I can remember when she came on the grounds in a surrey drawn by 2 horses, and Willie White, her son, was with her, and Miss McIntyre, her companion and nurse. And the meeting that night, she preached to us. I was sitting at her left hand about, 15 feet from her. Could see her plainly, of course, right there. Platform was about a foot and a half high. And she had this big, thick Bible. She was preaching faithfully, giving God's message. And I was interested. It was interesting. She was just a dear, sweet Christian mother or grandmother telling us what we ought to do. Just as she started to talk to finish off, it started to rain on that iron roof, and you can imagine. Now remember, no amplifiers in those days, except you carried your amplifier with you. And she's had a regular preaching voice, and you know, from this conversational tone or voice that she'd been using, she went into her real preaching voice. And you could hear her voice just like a silver bell right through all of that confusion caused by that rain. She could talk right through the rain noise. And then she talked just about a minute, and then she kneeled down to pray. She told her son, I must pray for us. And she came over on my side of the platform and kneeled down to pray. I can hear her now. She said, not our Father, but oh, my Father. And from that moment on, it was a personal communion between her and the Heavenly Father. In just a minute or two, there seemed to be a mighty power come over that meeting. And I felt it. I was just a boy, and I was a member of the church. I'd been baptized about a year and a half before. And I could feel that power until finally I was afraid to look up for fear I'd see God standing right there by. She was talking with him. She'd forgotten all about us. And she was in the presence of the Lord. And a minute or two more went by, and that whole crowd, you could hear them weeping, crying over their sin. A tremendous revival, really. Spiritual revival, that mighty power of God. When she preached, God blessed her as a preacher. But when she began to pray, he honored her as his prophet before the people. I'll never forget it.
And she prayed. Yeah. So, this is on one of the websites. And somebody asked me, is that really a picture of Ellen White? And I said, it looks faintly familiar. And somebody uses this kind of as a logo whenever they talk about Adventists. This is it looks a little sinister, don't you think?
Yeah.
Those deep dark eyes. It's like she was trying to audition for a part in a scary movie or something. I looked at the original picture. Subtle. But do you see there's kind of a pleasant look on her face?
Right.
Yeah. So I started thinking that, they'll say, well, that's her very picture, that's her very image. And sometimes they'll say, those are her very words. But if you just sled it just a little bit, it looks something a little different, doesn't it? And by the way, this is the original image where it came from. So it was just cut out of that. She just sitting there. And I noticed that a lot of these pictures, ever since she was in Australia, she had all of her teeth extracted. She had false teeth entirely. And you know how that kind of changes how your face looks? So the rest of the pictures that I saw of her, her mouth has that same expression. I think it's the dentures. And most photos that are of her, if they're taken in that era, you didn't smile in those days in pictures. Have you noticed that a lot of those pictures from the old days, they didn't? You know why that is? Because if you smile, your muscles fatigue after a while, and you get a blur in the image. So if your resting face, what do they call that? A really resting face or something like that. Some people have it. But if you're just resting your face as it normally is, it doesn't look so pleasant. But that's the way a lot of those pictures look. I think it's a little bit, it gives us some idea about, just a picture, how that people can see things differently, and then all they can do is pass along. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed it, but in that first picture, it had a different logo or website on the bottom. They were the ones who supplied the image. So it should be any surprise to us when one critic passes their knowledge or their appraisal of Ellen White to another critic who passes their appraisal. So all you got is one person passing it to another, and then they live in their own little bubble, and they all think they're right. And then when you challenge it, they attack you personally or accuse you of poor scholarship, in my case, reason. And I have to respond and say, I will avoid the personal issues and just share with you the facts, the evidence. I can't make anybody believe, but I can share what has been acknowledged to me and what I have discovered. So as a writer, this is one of the key issues that we'll be dealing with. As a writer, is it legitimate for an inspired writer to use the tools available to other writers? What do you think? Is it legitimate? Okay. Now, a lot of the attacks on her are addressing the issue that an inspired writer wouldn't do it that way. Whatever notion that they have of what an inspired writer would do, she's judged on the basis of that assumption. An inspired writer wouldn't do it that way. I had a discussion. The same fellow that Peter Dickson that I talked to, I popped in on another video, and he always has given me respect. I appreciate that. He's always given me respect. And I popped in when he was talking with another researcher. He interviews lots of different people, and mostly on the fringes of Adventism. Sometimes people that are well-known people within the church, and he'll get some of them on here too. But this particular subject, it was something I was knowledgeable about, and they treated me with respect when I responded to them. And so I asked the question, if she weren't an inspired writer, would it be wrong for her to adapt phrasing from another author? Would you consider that illegitimate? And they both said, no, people do that. Preachers do that. Yeah. Yeah, you hear something nice from somebody says it in a nice way. Hey, I'm gonna put that in my sermon, man. That's gonna hit it, you know. And so we preachers are a bunch of thieves when it comes to people's words. You know, and your only justification is if you steal a lot. You know, you got to get from different sources. But it's because why? Who cares where it came from? If it's the truth. Because in preaching, you don't get the footnotes unless you're calling somebody to a Bible verse or a quotation that's a particular quotation. You preach it. And if it preaches well, you preach it. So it isn't a matter of whether it's legitimate for other writers. The question is about an inspired writer, and that has to do with the way we think about inspiration. So I asked that question, is it legitimate for an inspired writer to use the tools of others? It's almost like they paint an inspired writer, one who gets visions, to say, it's only fair for you to use visions. Anybody else could do research. Anybody else could adapt wording from anybody else. Anybody else could do any of that, but because you're inspired, you can only say what God told you to say in a very rigid way. But is that what we find in the Bible? Well, we got some folks here who've seen some of my videos, so this will be a repetition of some of that. But we're going to take a look at some of the Bible writers and how they wrote. For example, John, book of Revelation. Like him, she wrote out what God gave her in panoramic vision. Okay? What did God say to John? What thou seest, write in a book. He didn't say, John, take dictation. Okay. See, some people think that inspiration means taking dictation. That God gives you kind of like these spiritualists who put their hands on the typewriter and, write up a story. But God didn't work that way. God works through the person's mind. And so for John, he showed the pictures, and John described it in exquisite detail, but the best that he could. Now, when I took the book of Revelation, studies of Revelation in school, they told me that there are mistakes in the Greek in the book of Revelation. I don't know whether that's true or not. Might be that in one region they say it one way, in another region they say it another. But it wasn't like his Greek in the book of John. So they postulated that John wrote on Patmos without the benefit of a proofreader like he might have had when he was back home writing the Gospel of John. Do we lose anything in that? If I say he don't do it right instead of he doesn't do it right, are you not going to understand me? I said one time, until you know the Word of God, don't you never quote Sister White. That was her actual words. They took it down. She used poetry. I looked at her original writings. Ron Granville. Some of you know the name Ron Granville? He used to work with the Light State for a while. He and I have gone through some of her handwriting manuscripts and transcribed it out. These are things that have already been published in polished form. But you see little mistakes. She doesn't capitalize everything. Sometimes when she's writing really fast, she doesn't put in all the periods and commas and stuff. Why? Because when they copy it, they're going to fix that. Does that make a person less inspired because they don't say everything perfectly? In fact, if God had to pick the people that had the best elocution, we'd be sunk. Because some of the people with the best elocution don't know nothing about spiritual things. Anyway, so John was shown pictures. He saw these panoramic views, and he was left to describe it. And he used different ways. If you studied into the background of it, I think you mentioned this in your presentation, that he used some wording from extra biblical as well as biblical. What's the big deal? She said, and over here, I am as dependent upon the Spirit of the Lord in writing my views as I am in receiving them, yet the words I employ in describing what I have seen are my own. My choice. My choice. Now, does it mean that it all comes from her vocabulary? No. We're going to see a little bit about that. Because sometimes she would find somebody who'd written it best, and she would take it. Sometimes it wasn't theologically correct, and she'd fix that. Sometimes it was a little wordy. A lot of times it was wordy, because the people that wrote back in those days, they wrote long sentences. Long sentences. She'd shorten it up. She'd tighten it up. Sometimes she would change one word or another to make it more precise. I can give you some examples of that. Don't have them on the slides, but examples like that. So she would find a gem of truth in one setting, take it, cut it, polish it, reset it in another place so that it could make that presentation sparkle. Now, some people, the critics in mind, this is where they get it wrong. They think that what she did was she just grabbed books off her shelf and just took it and put it together from all those books. But they haven't stopped to analyze what she takes and what she doesn't, how she adapts, how it fits in with what she's saying. And if you took that gem of thought out that actually just made it sparkle, if you took it out of the presentation, you'd still have the same presentation, just minus that sparkle. They haven't looked at that. So, legitimately, she chose the words. Who else we can compare to? Well, Solomon. I think you mentioned this one too, yeah. Solomon. He gathered gems of truth and fit words from many sources. That's what he tells us in Ecclesiastes. All right. The teacher searched out and set in order many proverbs, those are thought gems, and searched to find just the right words. And what does she do? Truths have been dug out and presented to the people as precious pearls of priceless value. Same thing. But God wouldn't do it that way. Oh, so you're going to find fault with John and Solomon, huh? Okay. What about Luke? You know, we speak of the Gospels as eyewitnesses of the life of Christ, but, Luke was not an eyewitness of the life of Christ. He came on board afterwards. So his Gospel is a little different. Luke in his Gospel adapted the accounts and words of earlier authors. It has been estimated, I think it's more of an estimate than a calculation, but Mark's Gospel, 91% of Mark's Gospel has been used in Matthew and Luke's Gospels. John's another thing. 91%. I say it's cannibalized, but it's a good anyway. Because you read Matthew, he's got one emphasis. Luke is a different emphasis, and Mark is a different. But same facts, same stories, some details a little different. I'm preaching through the life of Christ in my church right now, have been for about 80-some weeks, and it's all they saw him. It's the whole series. And so there's a richness in looking at the different stories of the life of Christ and trying to understand who's the one that saw it and who said what. And then when you compare multiple versions, you get nuances of meaning that you don't get otherwise. I recommend, if you don't have one, get a Harmony of the Gospels where it lays it down side by side, so you can look at the life of Christ in its full richness. I think it's a great thing. Luke, in his Gospel, adapted the writings of others. I did too. Yeah, here he says it. It seemed fitting to me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in an orderly sequence. Who's a researcher? What about Ellen White? In some cases where a historian has so grouped together events as to afford in brief a comprehensive view of the subjects, or has summarized details in a convenient manner, his words have been quoted in some instances. But other times, adapted, concentrated, to tell the story. Paul gained some of his information from common sources as well as divine revelation. Not everything that he wrote out in his epistles was something that was given to him in a dream or a vision. He received word, and so he responded to those things. And sometimes he said, I think I'm inspired in this. He wasn't even quite sure about his advice. But he can do that, as we find here. Oops, this side. For it has been reported to me, he says. And she says, I learned that the meeting in the tent last night was excellent and the attendance large. You don't stop being a human being because you're inspired. You still get information like every other human being. What about the writing of history? Like the authors of the Kings, she made use of known histories. How do we know that they used known histories? Because they tell us. They are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, and many other names that they give you, the annals of this, and the prophet Iddo, and they mention different sources. If you want to know more about this king, go to that book. They've adapted part of the history. And she says, when a historian has summarized details in a convenient manner, his words have been quoted. Just like those inspired writers. So how did she use sources? Here's a summary. And this is particular to Pastor Morgan. Others have gotten some of these points, but this is my extraction from having worked on the Desire Pages in particular and other books more largely. Especially her writings on the life of Paul. I published the whole book as a document. Here's how she used sources. First, as historical background. Is that legitimate? You want to tell the story? You can. Well, they certainly did it in the Bible, so that should be legitimate. Secondly, she used sources for perfecting her description of details. The Bible gives the outline, but then there may be some author who has described it particularly well. And so she would go to Hausen, Coney Barrenhausen. Any of you have ever heard that name, Coney Barrenhausen? Maybe not. So if you do, okay. Coney Barrenhausen wrote an excellent book, which Adventists sold and promoted through the Review and Herald. At the same time, they were selling and promoting Ellen White's book on the same period. Nothing to hide there. They were obviously selling to some of the same people. If they read it, they would see, yes, she has used the historical background in that book to be able to tell her history, but it's with a particular slant. It's not just history. So she used it for perfecting as sources of gems of thought, which we've already described. I want to give you an example of one of those gems of thought. And it served as storyline guides. This is the one that people least understood. What do I mean by a storyline guide? Those of you that have ever had to write a paper for college or high school, and you're supposed to tell about some person's life, some historical person, how do you start? A shortcut is to read what one or two other people have already written, so you make sure that you cover your bases, right? Now, you may write it a little different way. You will be docked and penalized if you just mess it up a little bit. Take somebody else's account and just paraphrase a little bit from there. That's not fair. But if you're writing and you use somebody's storyline guide that helps you to fit all the pieces together, and yet you tell it with your own point, your own perspective, you bring in other details from other sources, you weren't there, so you've got to rely on that. That's legit. She uses storyline guides. And how I recognize this is that sometimes she will follow the same course, and occasionally there'll be a unique word that'll pop up here or there, and you say, what are the chances that she used that unique word here? Now, there are a lot of times you would notice a difference, because how many ways are you going to talk about the crucifixion? Nails, crown of thorns. These are all common elements. That's not going to shock you. But if you use a certain way of describing it, a key word or phrase, you say, wait a second, she may have had this in the background when she was working. But is it indeed? Yeah. Does she say something different than what they say? Yeah. That's fully legitimate. And what I was trying to seed you to think about when we were talking about this before is that we've got to get away from the notion that she's just recounting visions. Because she may not have understood, she may not have seen every scene that's in the Bible that she's talking about. She may have, but she doesn't tell us whether she has. Is she inspired in how she comments on those stories? Yes. So, she's taking us through the story. It's from the Bible. It is inspired. But she's commenting on it. Did she see every scene that is described also in the Bible? Why would she need to? It's in the Bible. It's already. So these are the ways that she used sources. And if you can find another way, you can let me know. You can tell me that you found something to add a fifth point to Pastor Morgan's list. Let's take a look at how the book Desired Ages was put together. Now, I have to confess that I was rather naive about this, because I heard that Ellen White wrote the Desired Ages when she was in Australia. How many of you heard that? She wrote the Desired Ages when she was in Australia. And so my assumption was that she sat down in her cozy little chair. Now, I told you it wasn't so cozy. But she sat in her chair with her arms propped up, and she started off, let's see, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. All right, so I'll write about that, and take the story from there, down through the cross, to the ascension, to my God material. And then that's how it was written. And that's not how it was written. She started writing about the life of Christ in a little volume over here on the far left. That's Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, where she talks about some of the scenes that were penetratingly put in her mind. And she would say, I was carried down to, and she would describe those very specifically as part of the vision. But these are highlights of the story she'd included in that part of the book. But that wasn't good enough. She wanted to write about Jesus more. So from 1858 to 1864, she wrote a little bit more on the life of Christ and about his mission to earth entitled The Messiah in fourth volume of Spiritual Gifts. But that wasn't enough. She started writing to children about the life of Christ in the youth instructor articles, because she thought that it would be valuable for children to think about how that Jesus was raised and how that you could be consecrated as a child. And so she wrote some in youth instructors about the youth of Christ. And she wrote about other parts in Science and Times articles. And finally they said, well, let's do a renovation. And so then they did these volumes over here, the Spirit of Prophecy, volumes 2 and 3, which covers the whole life of Christ through the crucifixion and into the resurrection. And those books were translated into German and French I can't say it. Anybody know French enough to say what the life of Christ is in French? Anyway, it's literal translation, the life of Christ. And they have a different book in French than we have in English. It has some material that they started putting in, that she added to it, and they translated it. So there existed a manuscript somewhere that she wanted to produce as the life of Christ, but it wasn't good. She wanted more on the life of Christ. And so when she was in Australia, it isn't like she started to make a scene, but she would be impressed about one story in the life of Christ, and she might write about that same story more than once, maybe 3 or 4 times. And she would write, and then at the same time, they were asking her to write articles for the Signs of the Times, for the Review and Herald. She's a busy lady. And I don't know about you, but it takes me more than a week to write on it. It takes some research and some thought, and I hate to have to do that. It's one thing to get up here and speak off the cuff. It isn't perfect. You know, my language is not always exact. And you can speak, but it's another thing to write. It's got to be perfected. It takes some time. So they said, how are you going to do that? Well, they said, it's what we do. You write a manuscript, we'll turn it into an article, and then you can use it in the book. So here's what we've got. These are the sources for the Desire of Ages. It's a combination using the Spirit of Prophecy as the backbone. It's the main story. It follows pretty much the same order. But then, you see this up here? Dear Brother Robinson, letters. Marion Davis, her secretary, would gather from every source where she was writing on the life of Christ, including letters. Like I mentioned, there might be one little application that she would say, wow, the way you said this, it just really hits the mark. So she would take that little piece, and that would go into the manuscript. And then she would take some of her earlier books, and then there might be something like In Steps to Christ or Patriarchs and Prophets that was applicable. So she'd take some of that. So there'd be a piece from here, a piece from there, from manuscripts that she did write when she was in Australia, as well as, what else is here? That's it. Okay, so all these little different things, they're actually maybe a little bit from either Steve. Doesn't seem so because her oral communication is different than written. But for each of these ways, she put it together. And how I finally figured out how she did this was that D.E. Robinson came as a secretary after Desire of Ages was done, and he had the job of typing out the manuscript. Marion Davis didn't know how to type. So she didn't type it up, but she was kind of like the human gatherer, word processor. What she would do is she'd get all of these things and have it retyped and have all these different pages that were in different shapes and sizes, sometimes a little snippet here or there of something that she found, and she would number them, put them all in order, because she wanted them in the order, and she read it to the typist, who would then put it all in its proper order. Isn't it so nice to have computers these days? You can do all that by yourself. You just normally know how to type like that. And my daughter does not know touch typing, but she types almost as fast as I do, and I took touch typing at school. Anyway, so we'd read it all together, and once the manuscript was like in its readable form, she'd go sit down with Sister White, and they'd be reading it together, and Sister White would say, wait a second, there's something missing here. You know, we jump from here to here, there's something missing. And Mary would say, yeah, you're right. And White would say, I know just what it is. And so she would say, put this out. And so in Marion's own handwriting, which we don't even have these anymore, but she would write down that little transition that needed to go into the story, and they'd go on reading the rest of the manuscript to see how it was. And there are letters of hers that I have transcribed of Marion's, where she talks about this process and going back and forth with Pacific Press, who's going to publish it. What I've given you is the boiled-down version, but the truth is that she'd have a whole chapter already done. They'd send it to Pacific Press, which was like 2 weeks away by boat. They didn't have, teletype or the internet like we have today. And send the material over there, and she'd say, hold up. I just found something really good that Ellen White wrote in a letter. I want to squeeze it in. And so they'd hold the press, and they'd have to retypeset it, and not only retypeset it, because they were putting a lot of images in the first time, and those were a certain size. You could just go, if you need a little more space. It was already done. So they have to reword it slightly so that it would fit. So they actually sent another of Ellen White's secretaries who was trusted, who would not invent some new thing, but would just refine the language enough that they could fit it. She was going to go there to the Pacific Press to make those accommodations. And then the denomination said, she's so good, we need her at the review. Marion said, what are you doing? Send her here for this particular job. And so they got her back, and they were able to do it. It's a marvel to me that the book Desire of Ages was ever written with all of that kind of complication. But it was. And when you read it, it's like that car I told you about with the bad fender and the hood that was replaced, and you just with the paint job, and it looks like it was always that way, right? You read Desire of Ages, and it blesses your soul. Because you read the story of Christ, and it's almost as if you're stepping down into the story. And did you have that? I had that experience when I was reading about Jesus before Herod. And I said, she saw this. The way she described it, she saw this. It's the Bible, but it's described like, well, I had this experience. That really does help it here. Am I getting out of the camera? I walked in. Okay, you get up here. I was called in for a jury. My only time really being on a jury, and we had this fellow that was being accused. They had to follow the law. There's a guy that was supposedly making friends with people. When they go on vacation, he'd clean them out. That was the accusation. And jury selection was, he had a chance to deny people, like he was his own defense, basically, which is a dumb thing to do. But anyway, he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I said, I'm going to give this a fair shake. I'm going to give him a chance that if he's innocent, I'll say he's innocent. I'm not going to just assume, because the police are accusing him, that he was guilty. And he looked at me like, I'll pass. I was a pastor. But so he accepted me in jury. And I was listening for every way that I could think that this guy might possibly be innocent, as they're telling the story. But as it ends up, he's got 5 power saws in his basement. Who needs 5 power saws unless you run a crew? And he had Carhartt clothing that only, and it was getting worse and worse for me to try to defend this guy in my mind. And the last thing, when he faulted the police because they didn't notice certain details, and obviously they couldn't have been there and he called attention to only details only he would know because he was the one who wrote them. So we went back in the room, and it was not a hard matter to say, yeah, this guy's guilty. We came to it. It was unanimous. He had eyewitness details that nobody else had. And that's what I got impressed with as I was reading on. These are details that are so unique. This is not just imagination. This is real. Anyway, so put that all together, and you have the Desire of Ages. And it's fascinating. To me, it's fascinating because I put books together. And I've edited a bunch of books, and I know the process. All right, you want an example of a thought gem? Here's one. Nevertheless, it will do us all good, frequently and solemnly, to review the closing scenes in the Savior's earthly life. Amid all the material and worldly passions by which we are beset and tempted, we shall learn many salutary lessons by going back in memory and spending a thoughtful hour in the endeavor to strengthen our faith and quicken our love at the foot of the cross. Did that sound familiar a little bit? Yeah. Well, you already got Daniel March up there, so it gives it away. But I've read this to people without them seeing the author, and I said, who wrote that? Ellen White? Yeah, sounds like her. Because she took that thought gem and said, it would be well for us to spend a thoughtful hour each day in contemplation of the life of Christ. We should take it point by point and let the imagination grasp each scene, especially the closing ones. As we thus dwell upon his great sacrifice for us, our confidence in him will be more constant, our love will be quickened, and we shall be more deeply imbued with his Spirit. If we would be saved at last, we must learn the lesson of penitence and humiliation at the foot of the cross. Now, I know you're a prejudiced audience, but which one do you like better? You like what she did with it? Yeah. Is there a kernel of a truth that she adapted from the other fellow? Yeah. A thoughtful hour. You know which chapter this appears in? I'm surprised if you don't, because at the dinner table I called that question and somebody quoted book and verse, book and page. This is in the chapter when Mary and Joseph, by neglect of Jesus, thinking he was okay, walked off from him and left him in the temple. And she uses that illustration to remind us that it's possible for us to forget about Jesus in the course of our activities. It would be well for us to spend a thoughtful hour in the life of Christ. See the application? Yeah. New setting. Different setting from what he had. Some of the elements. So you get the idea of what a thought gem is? And do you begrudge her taking that from that passage in his writing and using it to make a point that reminds us that we really need to take time for Jesus every day. Take time to be holy. Yeah. Beautiful explanation from her about it. So, recently, put this post on the Ellen White Reconsidered channel on YouTube. You can do videos and you can also do little posts. More people see the videos than the posts. But this one I put up because it was just, it was one of those insights as I put it together. Why does the charge of plagiarism persist? Why does it persist? I came up with 3 reasons. I've already given you some of them, right? But this is a summary. First of all, writers have overestimated her usage of other authors. Walter Ray. Anybody heard the name Walter Ray? Okay, good. If you haven't, most of you haven't heard about it. He gave the Seventh-day Adventist Church a black eye in the 1980s. He's a pastor. He discovered some of these thought gems. Actually, he didn't. He plagiarized them from another guy and took credit for it. But that aside, personal friend of mine, we were talking about it. We were on a podcast and we talked about it. It was the title of it was about Ellen White, but it was giving credit. We had the actual guy who did the research, who Walter Ray took credit for it. He was ostensibly protected. He made this claim, and it was all over the internet, that Ellen White just willy-nilly pulled stuff off the shelves and, there's even a little cartoon of her. Can I see the no, she's busy writing. And she's yanking stuff off the shelf. I don't ever republish that because it's too vivid an image and it isn't the truth. That's not the way it was. But that's the way he saw it. He found a few little things, and he came to the conclusion that she had used 70 to 90% of her writings just were taken from somebody else. You know what the actual figure is? 4%. Yeah, that's what we've come up with. It's literal. Now, does she cover some of the same topics? If you're going to write on the life of Paul, how many topics are you going to cover that anybody else can not cover? It's the same material. If you're going to write on the life of Christ, are you going to tell stories that don't exist in the Gospels? Is that going to increase your credibility? Make stuff up. That there were aliens that came down and visited Jesus in Nazareth. What are you going to come up with that isn't in the Bible that is helpful to people? So you're going to cover some same stuff. But as far as using the wording, like thoughtful hour and that sort of thing, 4%. This comes from Tim Boyer's research. And that includes Desire Pages, by the way. Averaging it out. Desire Pages actually has more careful wording from other authors than any other book. Do you know why? It's a concentration process. When Ellen White wrote a letter to somebody and she wanted to make a point very clearly, sometimes she would adapt wording from another author to make that point. Now, you suppose when she wrote that person and she borrowed some wording from another author to make that point, she was thinking, I sure hope he thinks I'm a great author. I think she's saying, I'm praying that he'll get the point. And so when you adapt from, this is really well worded. Yeah, she borrowed it. She thought it was good, and she used it to write to her son or to some other author, of the Adventists. And Marion said, let's use that, so it's going to concentrate the number of thought gems in Desire Pages. She spent more time on the Desire Pages than any other book in the conflict series. 8 years in Australia working. So it's a concentrated thing. That's why it's there. It's to be pithy. And as I mentioned, sometimes she would write more than one manuscript on a certain subject. How do you use that? Does anybody know anything about cinematography? Anybody? Have you ever watched the outtakes? Any of you ever watched the outtakes? Those kind of things fascinate me. I take pictures of people taking pictures. That's what I look at best. And in making a movie, 90% of your footage never makes it into the final cut. Because they want the best angle, the best lighting, the best performance. It's the same scene, but it's taken different ways, and then the editor picks out the best. That's what Marion did with Ellen White's writings to tell the story. She'd have selections, and she would pick out the one that said it the best and put that in, and then have the secretary type it out, and she read it to them. So it's going to be concentrated, and Desire Pages is concentrated, and you've noticed that, haven't you? That it's just really, really vivid. When I took Life and Teachings of Jesus at Southern Missionary College, that's one of 3 institutions that I attended all in the same place. It kept changing its name. I took Life and Teachings. One of our textbook was the Desire Pages. And my first experience in college, they give you a little orientation, and they say, for every hour in class, you should spend so much time out of class preparing for your classes. I took way too much time for Life and Teachings. I would sit there and I would read, and I'd say, this is great. And so I started copying down in a notebook all these great quotations from Desire Pages. Put them down. I guess some of those have thought gems in them. I went back through. In fact, there's a video on my channel where I did this, and fewer people looked at it because they thought, that's not controversial. Anyway, it was on the Desire Pages. And I put I put down in order the quotations that I had written down in my notebook. Some of them had some thought gems. Some of them did. They were original with me. Didn't matter. They told truth in such a beautiful way that it impressed me. So 4% versus 90%, you think there's a little difference there? Okay, so writers have overestimated it by a long shot, and then, we've already covered this, people misunderstand inspiration. They say, God wouldn't do it that way. Oh, but God did work that way in the Bible. And you know what they'll say when you say that? You're trying to destroy the Bible to protect Ellen White. Are you kidding me? Okay, guy. No, I'm saying how does inspiration work in a work that you acknowledge as being inspired? And if you see that God can work that way, inspiring writers to write the Bible, then why is it wrong for Ellen White to do the exact same thing? Do we see a little hypocrisy here? Okay, it comes down to my third reason. Because it really doesn't have to do with the facts. The naysayers need to pick flaws. They need it to be wrong. For whatever reason. In my book, I have a list of things of why people, either they believed in Ellen White and gave up on her, or didn't believe in Ellen White and never accepted her gift, for the different reasons. It comes down to personal reasons in each case. In one case, it's somebody that she said, okay, we can ordain you. It wasn't her, it was the whole church in this case. But you can be ordained as a pastor. But we have these two concerns about you in your personal experience. We've already come to the conclusion that smoking is not good, and we don't want our ministers to have a bad example. So you're smoking. We would like for you to give up smoking. And we're also concerned about the fact that you're not having worship with your family. You know, doesn't the Bible say the elder leads his family and takes them with him spiritually? So we're concerned about those two things. He said, got it. I want to be ordained. I'll give up the smoking. We'll take care of the other problem too. And then he didn't give up the smoking. And he didn't fix the other problem. And then he didn't get ordained. And then he blamed Ellen White. Or the guy who had certain notions about prophecy, that he saw it this way, she saw it another way, therefore she must not be a prophet because obviously I'm the one that's right. And on it goes. Personal preference, personal perspectives, being chided, whatever, about something in their life they didn't want it. And so they needed to find some flaws. In the debate that I had, the discussion that I had, I ended up with a story talking about my dad. It just came to me on the fly because I wasn't prepped for this, but it was definitely something I had thought about. I mentioned that my books had separated, right? I went over to my dad's house, and he had under glass photographs, some of the family, but there's this one photograph that was a chair that had a bunch of unfolded clothes crumpled up in it. And I think a desk also that had some clothes piled up. And I thought, that is the weirdest thing to put under glass. But I concluded, and of course I can't check with my dad now to tell you whether it's true or not, but it seemed like that was kind of justification for why it was appropriate that he should leave. It's a reminder, that's why I left. Well, you can help me out. Thank you. Well, that's not my fault. He could pick that fault. In fact, one time, when I was a little frustrated with my mom later on in life, I became her primary caregiver after she had been a caregiver for my dad. My sister helped me on the weekends so I could preach. That's how that worked. We were having a discussion about keeping things orderly. And she said, yeah, that's what you're going to put on my tombstone, isn't it? She couldn't keep a clean house. And I said, no, Mom. I'm going to put, she always took time to listen. Now, with my dad, back to my dad, and his flaw that he picked in order to feel justified in his choices and where he had gone. He couldn't handle his life in the last years of his life. Dementia. And Mom took him in. Now, he wasn't so far gone that he didn't recognize me. I'm thankful for that. And I have to say, it was one of the most tremendous things in my life. If you've been a kid of a divorced family and you've had to live with that for a long time, you would wish, perhaps, like I did, that somehow that your folks could get back together. Although your better nature knows that it was kind of miserable and that's why they separated. Right? But in those last 2 years of his life, I could phone and I could talk to both of my parents at the same phone conversation. I was amazed. And I could talk to my dad. And my dad would say, your mom's a good woman. She raised you guys. And she takes pretty good care of you. Yeah, he even came down before that, he moved in with her, to a celebration of godly women at the church that she attended in South Florida. They had other women that were there, but he came the one time that I remember him in an Adventist church besides my brother's 8th grade graduation. He came for that to honor my mom. And he came up front and he said, I want to thank you all for honoring my bride. Yeah, he had already been saying the little flaws that he picked weren't good justification. And I hope that people come to that realization when it comes to Ellen. Let's see if I got it here right. What's up next? Yeah, I got it here right. His name Dudley M. Canwright. Some of you know about him. Father of the critics of Ellen White. Went to her memorial service. Was standing there with his brother. And with choked up emotion, he said, there is a noble Christian woman gone. He was a bit schizophrenic in the way that he criticized her. And yet, when it counted, he knew what kind of a woman she was. Those who think that she's trying to deceive somebody by using wording from other people to make the message get through, to communicate, are misunderstanding. That's where I think they get it wrong. And I can show that. I can demonstrate it from the evidence. I can give multiple examples, more than I've given this afternoon. And strangely, they don't all change their minds because they have a vested interest in not doing so. Lord, help them. Pray for them. Love them. Do all you can. Don't fight them. It doesn't do any good. Your job is to love them and let God take care of it.
To keep up with the latest in this series, be sure to subscribe to this channel